So in my research, I looked at the criticism, I studied the articles, I looked at the sociological framework in order to find more encompassing answers. And I'll just address briefly 4 main lines of criticism. Some of it has already been addressed. Missing quotations. Margaret Simons, in her groundbreaking article, definitely talked about that. The fact that there were many cuts, 10 to 15% of the original text had been cut. And also the fact that he was also described as, partially was described as working in isolation. So the quotation goes, untrained in philosophy, partially wrote in 1953 in isolation. He was also unfamiliar with the relatively new phenomenon of existentialism, and I'll address that shortly. And when I read the letters, I found out that it's not quite true. And then there was also another fact that there was a lot of philosophical content was mistranslated, and that's very interesting. Why? Because when I looked into it further, I found out that the publisher, basically the point of view that the publisher had is that the book was not a philosophical treatise, it was a scientific treatise. And they believed that in order to sell it, the best thing to do was to emphasize its scientific cachet, that Simone de Beauvoir had spent years on her scientific studies, which was not quite true. She was a philosopher, and she basically talked about existentialism. And why did the publisher take this kind of approach? The reason was that in their minds, what they wanted to do was to present the second sex as the French counterpart to the Kinsey report, the sexual behavior in the human male that was published in 1948, but this time for women. And it was also described by one reviewer in 1953, Brendan Gill, as probably, and I quote, probably the best manual of instruction on making love now available in English. So this was basically, when you look at the publication, the promotion posters, they really advertise it as a scientific book, and especially the prurient aspect of the book. Although Beauvoir scholars are most certainly right to criticize the traduced philosophical content, quote, some of the philosophers have analyzed it quite in detail, and there was definitely a need for a new translation, especially when we look at the philosophical content, but you can kind of imagine where this direction came from. However, the critics also need to realize that the existentialist terminology did not quite exist in English at the time. So the translation, the second sex in French came out in 1949, the translation came out in 1953. Sartre's Being and Nothingness, which is a major work for existentialism, came out in its English translation in 1956. So what the translator did, he read a lot of books on existentialism in French and whatever English translation he could find. So he did read about it. He wanted to talk about it as well in his preface. So you could also say that at that time, because the translation came out so quickly, that there wasn't really, the translator was swimming in uncharted waters. There wasn't such a fixed existentialist terminology. Another quick note is that Parsha did try to get help from Beauvoir, but there was only one letter that he received from her, and he did ask Blanche Knopf for a lot of help. But Blanche Knopf never got a chance to meet with Beauvoir in Paris on one of her trips. So his answer to how do you translate alterity, he never really got that answer. So he had to deal with it on his own. And I'll just give you a couple of excerpts from the letters. So it's related to discussions on philosophy and the translator's preface that was initially intended to have an elaborate explanation on existentialism. And this is a letter from Blanche Knopf to Parsley in 1951, once she had reviewed his preface. I like your preface very much indeed. The only thing that I want to point out to you is that existentialism is really a dead duck. Where you have to mention it, of course you will, but it seems of no great importance any longer in the literary world of France or anywhere else. So partially replied to her in commenting that existentialism is really a dead duck. I suppose you mean that it is no longer a current sensation, as you say, in the literary world, but I fancy that Sartre's novels have some permanent value, and certainly Le Deuxième Sexe contains enough existentialist material to require some special mention. He did mention it in his preface, but it was in a much shorter version. And another, so throughout the 3 years of correspondence, roughly 3 years, when I read the letters, I can see that the editor-in-chief, Harold Strauss, who was the primary correspondent with Parsley, his main preoccupations were with clarity, simplicity, condensation, and packaging to the average, and I quote, average American reader, end quote, for the highest possible sales. And one quote, and therefore, and this goes after, it's really hard, I hate giving you quotations just like that. Therefore, I think it is essential to do everything possible to lighten the burden of the American reader. And then the dialogue does go back and forth quite a bit between the two, but the translator being the translator and the publisher being the publisher, editor-in-chief, that's how it works in the publishing industry. So who had the final say? So the letters reveal also editors' less than flattering views of the American reader, but they also reveal the pressure that the publisher had to face. They had to sell the book, and they had their own pressures and restrictions, and they had to sell the book. The book was already very heavy, and it was going to cost $10, and they used to set the price according to the weight at the time. So he was asked, Parsley was asked to cut. He was asked about the cuts even before he started translating. So back in 1949. So he was asked about it by the president, Alfred Knopf. And toward the end, once the translation had been finished, there was another very interesting quote where Alfred Knopf wrote to Parsley. I'm reading the Beauvoir, and I must say I think you have done a magnificent job on the lady. She certainly suffers from verbal diarrhea. I've seldom read a book that seems to run in such concentric circles. I can hardly imagine the average person reading the whole book carefully, but I think it is capable of making a very wide appeal indeed. To conclude, in my thesis I did try to include letters in their entirety because I think it's very crucial to read them in the whole context. So the reading of the correspondence basically gave me a glimpse into this manufacturing process of the translation. And in this particular case, I believe also in many other cases, editors are very involved. They will set the direction. They will set the tone. So basically, they also have many departments, and they also look at how to, sell the book to the public. So those are things to keep in mind. And why was it so important to me is because I'm a translator and I study in translation studies, so we look at the role of the translator and then we look at the criticism of the translator's work. And we need to remember that the translators very often, they don't work in isolation. They do their work perhaps in isolation, but their work is revised and reviewed, and there's a lot of decisions that can take place. And before we make any final judgment, we also need to look into it further and remember that this wasn't just translating and then put to print and just distribute it. There's always somebody else reading it. So in this particular, this is what happened. This was my goal, to look into the first translation, and this is what I found, just briefly. And I also basically wanted to draw kind of the lessons whenever we criticize any other translator. It's very easy to criticize translations. How do we, major questions, critical questions, how do we evaluate translations? That's what we talk about in translation studies a lot. And do translations bring any glory to the translator? Hard questions, but what I can say for now is that, at least for me, the most important thing is that the world is talking about Simone de Beauvoir more than ever. Well, not more than ever, but at least it's coming back. And that's very important because we want to focus on the ideas that Beauvoir had and the second sex, and that's why we're all here, to celebrate the translation. Thank you.
Right, now you've heard from us. Now we'd like to hear from you. I hope you have a few questions at least for our translators. I believe there are people with mics. Peter? There's a young woman right there with a mic. Somebody right there with a mic. There's the first question right here.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was excellent. I just wanted to know a little more about your process of translation, since you did a sort of a team translation. How did you work? Did you work together as the same parts of the text, or did you work separately and then compare it, or how did you work?
We do about 10 pages each, separate and separately, and then we cross it over, we give it to the other person, and the other person's role is to tear it apart, or not. And then we take out points that the first person who wrote it agrees with, will change, accept, and then points that you're not sure you'd like to accept on the little 10 pages that you did. Then you enter into a long discussion. So it's really a very deep discussion. When you translate alone, it's very hard to have that discussion with yourself. But when you translate with somebody else, you really do probe very, very deeply into the text. It got to the point that we don't remember who wrote what, or who began the translation. The only way I recognize when Sheila translates is she puts one space after her periods, and I put two. And so that's how I can tell, we can tell where the original text was. But I said, didn't you wrote this? And she said, no, you're the one that wrote that. It goes back and forth. It's incredible.
The other way, more technically, we sent it by email, even though we live very close to each other. And we color-coded it. We didn't do track changes because that's too complicated. We just had a color, each of us, and we would go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, maybe 10 times. And then in the middle, in any case, we would be available for each other, who one person would say, listen, I'm translating this page and I really don't understand it. Can we talk about it? And so we would jump to that, back or forth or whatever, and discuss something at great length. And that's how it went back and forth and back and forth.
And if you were among our unfortunate friends who had dinner with us at any period for those 4 years, you would have also been subjected to helping us try to figure out where the subject and the verb were, and interpreting a sentence that might be particularly difficult. Everybody actually had fun with the translation. Yes. Our husbands loved when we asked them questions. We also don't sleep very much at night, so we can work very far into the morning, and we get up very early, and we start working very early. But we work very long hours.
And that, too, our husbands were extremely complicit and helpful because they never complained about being woken up at all hours of the day and night.